The American Revolutionary War, April 19, 1775, September 3, 1783, also known as the Revolutionary War or American War of Independence, was the armed conflict that comprised the final 8 years of the broader American Revolution, in which American patriot forces organized as the Continental Army and commanded by George Washington defeated the British Army. The conflict was fought in North America, the Caribbean, and the Atlantic Ocean. The war's outcome seemed uncertain for most of the war, but Washington and the Continental Army's decisive victory in the Siege of Yorktown in 1781 led King George III and the Kingdom of Great Britain to negotiate an end to the war. In 1783, in the Treaty of Paris, the British monarchy acknowledged the independence of the 13 colonies, leading to the establishment of the United States as an independent and sovereign nation. In 1763, after the British Empire gained dominance in North America following its victory over the French in the 7 Years' War, tensions and disputes began escalating between the British and the 13 colonies, especially following passage of Stamp and Townshend Acts. The British Army responded by seeking to occupy Boston militarily, leading to the Boston Massacre on March 5, 1770. In mid-1774, with tensions escalating even further between the British Army and the colonies, the British Parliament imposed the Intolerable Acts, an attempt to disarm Americans, leading to the battles of Lexington and Concord in April 1775, the first battles of the Revolutionary War. In June 1775, the Second Continental Congress voted to incorporate colonial-based patriot militias into a central military, the Continental Army, and unanimously appointed Washington its commander-in-chief. 2 months later, in August 1775, the British Parliament declared the colonies to be in a state of rebellion. In July 1776, the Second Continental Congress formalized the war, passing the Lee Resolution on July 2, and 2 days later unanimously adopting the Declaration of Independence on July 4. In March 1776, in an early win for the newly formed Continental Army under Washington's command, following a successful siege of Boston, the Continental Army successfully drove the British Army out of Boston. British Commander-in-Chief William Howe responded by launching the New York and New Jersey campaign, which resulted in Howe's capture of New York City in November. Washington responded by clandestinely crossing the Delaware River and winning small but significant victories at Trenton and Princeton. In the summer of 1777, as Howe was poised to capture Philadelphia, the Continental Congress fled to Baltimore. In October 1777, a separate northern British force under the command of John Burgoyne was forced to surrender at Saratoga in an American victory that proved crucial in convincing France and Spain that an independent United States was a viable possibility. France signed a commercial agreement with the rebels, followed by a treaty of alliance in February 1778. In 1779, the Sullivan expedition undertook a scorched earth campaign against the Iroquois, who were largely allied with the British. Indian raids on the American frontier, however, continued to be a problem. Also, in 1779, Spain allied with France against Great Britain in the Treaty of Aranjuez, though Spain did not formally ally with the Americans. Howe's replacement, Henry Clinton, intended to take the war against the Americans into the southern colonies. Despite some initial success, British General Cornwallis was besieged by a Franco-American army in Yorktown, Virginia in September and October 1781. The French Navy cut off Cornwallis's escape, and he was forced to surrender in October. The British wars with France and Spain continued for another 2 years, but fighting largely ceased in North America. In the Treaty of Paris, signed on September 3, 1783, Great Britain acknowledged the sovereignty and independence of the United States, bringing the American Revolutionary War to an end. The Treaties of Versailles resolved Great Britain's conflicts with France and Spain, and forced Great Britain to cede Tobago, Senegal, and small territories in India to France, and Minorca, West Florida, and East Florida to Spain. 4445. Prelude to War. Main article, American Revolution. Further information. American Enlightenment, Colonial History of the United States, 13 Colonies, and French and Indian War. Map of the 1763 Treaty of Paris claims in North America by the British and Spanish. The British claim east of the Mississippi River, including the Floridas ceded by Spain, and the previous French North America along the St. Lawrence River, west through the Great Lakes, and southerly along the east bank of the Mississippi River. Spanish claims added French cessions from French Louisiana east to the Mississippi River. Map showing the territorial gains of Great Britain and Spain following the French and Indian War, with lands held by the British prior to 1763. In red, land gained by Britain in 1763, in pink, and lands ceded to the Kingdom of Spain in secret during 1762, in light yellow. The French and Indian War, part of the wider global conflict known as the 7 Years' War, ended with the 1763 Peace of Paris, which expelled France from their possessions in New France. 46. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 was designed to refocus colonial expansion north into Nova Scotia and south into Florida, with the Mississippi River as the dividing line between British and Spanish possessions in America. Settlement was tightly restricted beyond the 1763 limits, and claims west of this line, including by Virginia and Massachusetts, were rescinded. 47. With the exception of Virginia and others deprived of rights to western lands, the colonial legislatures agreed on the boundaries but disagreed on where to set them. Many settlers resented the restrictions entirely, and enforcement required permanent garrisons along the frontier, which led to increasingly bitter disputes over who should pay for them. 48. Taxation and legislation. Further information, Boston Tea Party and Pine Tree Riot. The huge debt incurred by the 7 Years' War and demands from British taxpayers for cuts in government expenditure meant Parliament expected the colonies to fund their own defense. 48. The 1763 to 1765 Grenville Ministry instructed the Royal Navy to cease trading smuggled goods and enforce customs duties levied in American ports. 48. The most important was the 1733 Molasses Act. Routinely ignored before 1763, it had a significant economic impact since 85% of New England rum exports were manufactured from imported molasses. These measures were followed by the Sugar Act and Stamp Act, which imposed additional taxes on the colonies to pay for defending the western frontier. 49. The taxes proved highly burdensome, particularly for the poorer classes, and quickly became a source of discontent. 50. In July 1765, the Whigs formed the first Rockingham Ministry, which repealed the Stamp Act and reduced tax on foreign molasses to help the New England economy, but reasserted parliamentary authority in the Declaratory Act. 51. However, this did little to end the discontent. In 1768, a riot started in Boston when the authorities seized the sloop Liberty on suspicion of smuggling. 52. Tensions escalated in March 1770 when British troops fired on rock-throwing civilians, killing 5 in what became known as the Boston Massacre. 53. The massacre coincided with the partial repeal of the Townshend Acts by the Tory-based North Ministry. North insisted on retaining duty on tea to enshrine Parliament's right to tax the colonies. The amount was minor, but ignored the fact it was that very principal Americans found objectionable. 54. In April 1772, colonialists staged the first American tax revolt against British royal authority in Ware, New Hampshire, later referred to as the Pine Tree Riot. 55. This would inspire the design of the pine tree flag. Tensions escalated following the destruction of a customs vessel in the June 1772 Gaspee affair, then came to a head in 1773. A banking crisis led to the near collapse of the East India Company, which dominated the British economy. To support it, Parliament passed the Tea Act, giving it a trading monopoly in the 13 colonies. Since most American tea was smuggled by the Dutch, the act was opposed by those who managed the illegal trade, while being seen as another attempt to impose the principle of taxation by Parliament. 56. In December 1773, a group called the Sons of Liberty disguised as Mohawks dumped crates of tea into Boston Harbor, an event later known as the Boston Tea Party. The British Parliament responded by passing the so-called Intolerable Acts, aimed specifically at Massachusetts, although many colonists and members of the Whig opposition considered them a threat to liberty in general. This increased sympathy for the Patriot cause locally, in the British Parliament, and in the London press. 57. Break with the British Crown. Further information. Battles of Lexington and Concord and First Continental Congress. Throughout the 18th century, the elected lower houses in the colonial legislatures gradually wrested power from their governors. 58. Dominated by smaller landowners and merchants, these assemblies now established ad hoc provincial legislatures, effectively replacing royal control. With the exception of Georgia, 12 colonies sent representatives to the First Continental Congress to agree on a unified response to the crisis. 59. Many of the delegates feared that a boycott would result in war and sent a petition to the king calling for the repeal of the Intolerable Acts. 60. After some debate, on September 17, 1774, Congress endorsed the Massachusetts-Suffolk Resolves and on October 20 passed the Continental Association, which instituted economic sanctions and a boycott of goods against Britain. 61. While denying its authority over internal American affairs, a faction led by James Duane and future Loyalist Joseph Galloway insisted Congress recognize Parliament's right to regulate colonial trade. 61W. Expecting concessions by the North administration, Congress authorized the colonial legislatures to enforce the boycott. This succeeded in reducing British imports by 97% from 1774 to 1,775. 62. However, on February 9, Parliament declared Massachusetts to be in rebellion and instituted a blockade of the colony. 63. In July, the Restraining Acts limited colonial trade with the British West Indies and Britain and barred New England ships from the Newfoundland cod fisheries. The tension led to a scramble for control of militia stores, which each assembly was legally obliged to maintain for defense. 64. On April 19, a British attempt to secure the Concord arsenal culminated in the battles of Lexington and Concord, which began the Revolutionary War. 65. Political reactions. Main article, Olive Branch Petition. The artist's recreation of the Declaration signing with portraits of the entire Second Congress, as though all members were present. The Committee of Five are standing centered together, presenting a parchment on the table. The Committee of Five who were charged with drafting the Declaration of Independence, including, from left to right, John Adams, Chair, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration's principal author, and Benjamin Franklin. After the Patriot victory at Concord, moderates in Congress led by John Dickinson drafted the Olive Branch Petition, offering to accept royal authority in return for George III mediating in the dispute. 66. However, since the petition was immediately followed by the declaration of the causes and necessity of taking up arms, Colonial Secretary Lord Dartmouth viewed the offer as insincere and refused to present the petition to the king. 67. Although constitutionally correct. Since the monarch could not oppose his own government, it disappointed those Americans who hoped he would mediate in the dispute, while the hostility of his language annoyed even loyalist members of Congress. 66. Combined with the proclamation of rebellion, issued on August 23 in response to the battle at Bunker Hill, It ended hopes of a peaceful settlement. 68. Backed by the Whigs, Parliament initially rejected the imposition of coercive measures by 170 votes, fearing an aggressive policy would drive the Americans towards independence. 69. However, by the end of 1774, the collapse of British authority meant both Lord North and George III were convinced war was inevitable. 70. After Boston, Gage halted operations and awaited reinforcements. The Irish Parliament approved the recruitment of new regiments, while allowing Catholics to enlist for the first time. 71. Britain also signed a series of treaties with German states to supply additional troops. 72. Within a year, it had an army of over 32,000 men in America, the largest ever sent outside Europe at the time. 73. The employment of German soldiers against people viewed as British citizens was opposed by many in Parliament and by the colonial assemblies. Combined with the lack of activity by Gage, opposition to the use of foreign troops allowed the Patriots to take control of the legislatures. 74. Declaration of Independence. Main article: United States Declaration of Independence. Support for independence was boosted by Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense, which was published on January 10, 1776, and argued for American self-government and was widely reprinted. 75. To draft the Declaration of Independence, the Second Continental Congress appointed the Committee of Five: Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. 76. The Declaration was written almost exclusively by Jefferson. 77. Identifying inhabitants of the 13 colonies as one people. The Declaration simultaneously dissolved political links with Britain, while including a long list of alleged violations of English rights committed by George III. This is also one of the first times that the colonies were referred to as United States, rather than the more common United Colonies. 78. On July 2, Congress voted for independence and published the Declaration on July 4. 79. At this point, the Revolution ceased to be an internal dispute over trade and tax policies between the 13 colonies and Great Britain, becoming a civil war, with each state represented in Congress engaged in a struggle with Britain. The conflict was also a civil war between American patriots and American loyalists. 80 patriots generally supported independence from Britain and a new national union in Congress, while loyalists remained aligned with British rule. Estimates of numbers vary, one suggestion being the population as a whole was split evenly between committed patriots, committed loyalists, and those who were indifferent. 81 others calculate the split as 40% patriot, 40% neutral, 20% loyalist, but with considerable regional variations. 82. At the onset of the war, the Second Continental Congress realized defeating Britain required foreign alliances and intelligence gathering. The Committee of Secret Correspondence was formed for the sole purpose of corresponding with our friends in Great Britain and other parts of the world. 83. From 1775 to 1776, the committee shared information and built alliances through secret correspondence, as well as employing secret agents in Europe to gather intelligence, conduct undercover operations, analyze foreign publications, and initiate patriot propaganda campaigns. 84. Paine served as secretary, while Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane, sent to France, Britain's longtime rival, to recruit military engineers. 85. Were instrumental in securing French aid in Paris. 86. War breaks out. Main articles: Northern Theater of the American Revolutionary War and Southern Theater of the American Revolutionary War. See also Western Theater of the American Revolutionary War. Further information: Naval Battles of the American Revolutionary War. Early engagements. Further information: Battles of Lexington and Concord and shot heard round the world. snow-covered street fighting of British and Tory provincials, repulsing an American assault. The British repulse a Continental Army attack at the Battle of Quebec in December 1775. Continental Sergeant William Jasper of the 2nd South Carolina Regiment, on a parapet raising the fort's South Carolina Revolutionary flag with its white crescent moon. Sergeant William Jasper of the 2nd South Carolina Regiment raises the fort's flag at the Battle of Sullivan's Island in Charleston, South Carolina, in June 1776. On April 14, 1775, Sir Thomas Gage, Commander-in-Chief, North America and Governor of Massachusetts, received orders to take action against the Patriots. He decided to destroy militia ordnance stored at Concord, Massachusetts, and capture John Hancock and Samuel Adams, who were considered the principal instigators of the rebellion. The operation was to begin around midnight on April 19, in the hope of completing it before the American Patriots could respond. 87-88, however, Paul Revere learned of the plan and notified Captain Parker, commander of the Concord militia, who prepared to resist. 89. The first action of the war, commonly referred to as the shot heard round the world, was a brief skirmish at Lexington, followed by the full-scale battles of Lexington and Concord. British troops suffered around 300 casualties before withdrawing to Boston, which was then besieged by the militia. 90. In May 1775, 4,500 British reinforcements arrived under Generals William Howe, John Bergen, and Sir Henry Clinton. 91. On June 17, they seized the Charlestown Peninsula at the Battle of Bunker Hill, a frontal assault in which they suffered over 1,000 casualties. 92. Dismayed at the costly attack which had gained them little. 93. Gage appealed to London for a larger army. 94. But instead was replaced as commander by Howe. 92. On June 14, 1775, Congress took control of Patriot forces outside Boston, and congressional leader John Adams nominated Washington as commander-in-chief of the newly formed Continental Army. 95. On June 16, Hancock officially proclaimed him General and Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the United Colonies. He assumed command on July 3, preferring to fortify Dorchester Heights outside Boston rather than assaulting it. 97. In early March 1776, Colonel Henry Knox arrived with heavy artillery acquired in the capture of Fort Ticonderoga. 98. Under cover of darkness, on March 5, Washington placed these on Dorchester Heights. 99. From where they could fire on the town and British ships in Boston Harbor. Fearing another Bunker Hill, Howe evacuated the city on March 17 without further loss and sailed to Halifax, Nova Scotia, while Washington moved south to New York City. 100. Beginning in August 1775, American privateers raided towns in Nova Scotia, including St. John, Charlottetown, and Yarmouth. In 1776, John Paul Jones and Jonathan Eddy attacked Canso and Fort Cumberland respectively. British officials in Quebec began negotiating with the Iroquois for their support. 101. While U.S. envoys urged them to remain neutral. 102. Aware of Native American leanings toward the British and fearing an Anglo-Indian attack from Canada, Congress authorized a second invasion in April 1775. 103. After the defeat at the Battle of Quebec on December 31, 104, the Americans maintained a loose blockade of the city until they retreated on May 6, 1776. 105. A second defeat at Trois-Rivières on June 8 ended operations in Quebec. 106. British pursuit was initially blocked by American naval vessels on Lake Champlain, until victory at Valker Island on October 11 forced the Americans to withdraw to Fort Ticonderoga. While in December an uprising in Nova Scotia sponsored by Massachusetts was defeated at Fort Cumberland. 107. These failures impacted public support for the Patriot cause. 108. And aggressive anti-loyalist policies in the New England colonies alienated the Canadians. 109. In Virginia, Dunmore's proclamation on November 7, 1775, promised freedom to any slaves who fled their Patriot masters and agreed to fight for the crown. 110 British forces were defeated at Great Bridge on December 9 and took refuge on British ships anchored near Norfolk. When the Third Virginia Convention refused to disband its militia or accept martial law, Lord Dunmore ordered the burning of Norfolk on January 1, 1776, 111. The Siege of Savage's Old Fields began on November 19 in South Carolina between Loyalist and Patriot militias, 112, and the Loyalists were subsequently driven out of the colony in the Snow Campaign. 113 Loyalists were recruited in North Carolina to reassert British rule in the South. But they were decisively defeated in the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge. 114. A British expedition sent to reconquer South Carolina launched an attack on Charleston in the Battle of Sullivan's Island on June 28, 1776, 115. But it failed. 116. A shortage of gunpowder led Congress to authorize a naval expedition against the Bahamas to secure ordnance stored there. 117. On March 3, 1776, an American squadron under the command of Essex Hopkins landed at the east end of Nassau and encountered minimal resistance at Fort Montagu. Hopkins' troops then marched on Fort Nassau. Hopkins had promised Governor Montfort Brown and the civilian inhabitants that their lives and property would not be in any danger if they offered no resistance. They complied. Hopkins captured large stores of powder and other munitions that was so great he had to impress an extra ship in the harbor to transport the supplies back home. When he departed on March 17, 118, a month later, after a brief skirmish with HMS Glasgow, they returned to New London, Connecticut, the base for American naval operations. 119. British New York counteroffensive. Main article: New York and New Jersey campaign. Further information: Battle of Fort Washington and Battle of Long Island. Sailing ships on the Hudson River from afar. The scene emphasizes the two tall bluffs overlooking either side of the Hudson Narrows. The British used the Narrows, connecting Upper and Lower New York Bay, to isolate Fort Washington in the Battle of Fort Washington in November 1776. After regrouping at Halifax in Nova Scotia, 120 Howe set sail for New York in June 1776 and began landing troops on Staten Island near the entrance to New York Harbor on July 2. The Americans rejected Howe's informal attempt to negotiate peace on July 30, 121. Washington knew that an attack on the city was imminent and realized that he needed advance information to deal with disciplined British regular troops. On August 12, 1776, Patriot Thomas Knowlton was ordered to form an elite group for reconnaissance and secret missions. Knowlton's Rangers, which included Nathan Hale, became the Army's first intelligence unit. 122X. When Washington was driven off Long Island, he soon realized that he would need to professionalize military intelligence. With aid from Benjamin Tallmadge, Washington launched the six-man Culper spy ring. 125Y. The efforts of Washington and the Culper spy ring substantially increased the effective allocation and deployment of Continental regiments in the field. 125. Throughout the war, Washington spent more than 10% of his total military funds on military intelligence. 126. Washington split the Continental Army into positions on Manhattan and across the East River in western Long Island. 127. On August 27, at the Battle of Long Island, Howe outflanked Washington and forced him back to Brooklyn Heights, but he did not attempt to encircle Washington's forces. 128. Through the night of August 28, Knox bombarded the British. Knowing they were up against overwhelming odds, Washington ordered the assembly of a war council on August 29. All agreed to retreat to Manhattan. Washington quickly had his troops assembled and ferried them across the East River to Manhattan on flat-bottomed freight boats without any losses in men or ordnance, leaving General Thomas Mifflin's regiments as a rearguard. 129. Howe met with a delegation from the Second Continental Congress at the September Staten Island Peace Conference, but it failed to conclude peace, largely because the British delegates only had the authority to offer pardons and could not recognize independence. 130. On September 15, Howe seized control of New York City when the British landed at Kips Bay and unsuccessfully engaged the Americans at the Battle of Harlem Heights the following day. 131. On October 18, Howe failed to encircle the Americans at the Battle of Pell's Point, and the Americans withdrew. Howe declined to close with Washington's army on October 28 at the Battle of White Plains, and instead attacked a hill that was of no strategic value. 132. Washington's retreat isolated his remaining forces, and the British captured Fort Washington on November 16. The British victory there amounted to Washington's most disastrous defeat, with the loss of 3,000 prisoners. 133. The remaining American regiments on Long Island fell back 4 days later. 134. General Henry Clinton wanted to pursue Washington's disorganized army, but he was first required to commit 6,000 troops to capture Newport, Rhode Island. To secure the Loyalist port, 135Z, General Charles Cornwallis pursued Washington, but Howe ordered him to halt. 137. The outlook following the defeat at Fort Washington appeared bleak for the American cause. The reduced Continental Army had dwindled to fewer than 5,000 men and was reduced further when enlistments expired at the end of the year. 138. Popular support wavered, and morale declined. On December 20, 1776, the Continental Congress abandoned the revolutionary capital of Philadelphia and moved to Baltimore, where it remained until February 27, 1777. 139. Loyalist activity surged in the wake of the American defeat, especially in New York State. 140.